Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today with us for our Rusty Patch Bumblebee training for Iowa and Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas participants. As we wait for folks to trickle in, we're just going to do a quick round of introductions. I can start us off. My name is Genevieve Kojesic. I am a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Bumblebee Atlas. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I work in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska. I'll hand it off to Elaine.
Hello, I am Elaine Evans. I'm an extension educator and researcher at the University of Minnesota. With Jenny and Elise helping to coordinate the Bumblebee Atlas, and then I also do various other projects, some with public participation, looking for bumblebee nests, and also just pollinator education and a bunch of other miscellaneous stuff. I'll hand it over to Elise.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Bernstein. I'm a researcher and outreach coordinator with the University of Minnesota Bee Squad. The Bee Squad is the outreach and education team here at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. Also working on the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas, as well as some other projects like that public participation bumblebee nest searching project Elaine just mentioned called Nest Quest, and then doing generally other pollinator education in the Twin Cities.
Thanks, guys. So once again, I just want to thank everyone for being here with us today, for spending our lunch time with us. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Today, we're going to be talking about rusty patch bumblebees, how to identify them, and also how to work within federal protections for this species. You can go ahead and move forward, Elaine. So, as I mentioned, I work for the Xerces Society. The Bumblebee Atlas in Iowa and Minnesota are both projects that are supported by the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society is a non-profit organization focused on invertebrate conservation. We're a member-supported organization, so the work that we do is thanks in part due to the support from our members. So I just want to give a quick shout out to anybody who's in the audience today who is a member. This work is possible because of your support. And then I'll hand it off to Elaine and Elise for the core part of this presentation.
All right, so a quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to start with just some background about Rusty Patch Bumblebee. We'll look over what's going on, how Rusty Patch Bumblebee impacts grid adoption for our Atlas surveys, figuring out where to survey, what to do if you find a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and we'll end with some ID information. So some background on Rusty Patch Bumblebee. Before the year 2000, Rusty Patch bumblebees were commonly found throughout much of Eastern North America. They weren't the most common bumblebees, but they were within, like kind of the top 5 species that we would see here around the Twin Cities and in many other places, very abundant bumblebees. In 1999, there was a commercial facility that was rearing bumblebees, a species called the Western bumblebee, which is in the same subgenus, so like a cousin of the Rusty Patch bumblebee, that was being raised commercially, and there was failure of commercial rearing facilities. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that the year after that, people who were paying attention to bumblebees started noticing the disappearance of Rusty Patch bumblebees across the range, as well as declines in that Western bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee, which were all closely related to that Western bumblebee. So one of the tricky things with when a species really declines is after it declines, figuring out why they declined, because there's not as many of them around anymore. But one of the main things that is one of the main suspects for why Rusty Patch bumblebee declined was spillover of disease from that commercial rearing facility, and there was some transportation of bees between facilities in Europe and North America, the timing of declines, all the bees in that were closely related in that same subgenus declined around the same time. With some of the species, with rusty patch bumblebee out in the east and with the western bumblebee out in the west, where there was higher elevations, there were kind of refuges. So that kind of fits with the idea that that this could have been spillover of this disease, but there hasn't been any evidence of there being similar strains from the commercial and the wild bees. And there's also some evidence that some declines could have started even before that all was happening. So it's really hard to know exactly what went on with the decline. There's other things like climate change that we know are impacting bumblebees. We know that for pesticides, the increase in the use of neonicotinoids, which we know are something that do negatively impact bumblebees. The timing of this decline, matches a bit with that. So that's just to give you an overview of, we don't know exactly what was going on with why they declined, but we, started to just look into what was happening. We'd first noticed that kind of in the year 2000. I actually used to work for the Xerces Society as well. So when in their bumblebee conservation work, so I worked for them back in 2007, trying to figure out what was going on. So, something can be declined one year and, you just kind of wonder what happened. But it was multiple years where people were not seeing rusty patch bumblebees and these other two species of closely related species. So we did a status review and we did see that there were declines across, big declines across a lot of the range. At Xerces, we started a public education campaign just to get people aware of that we want information about these bees. People were taking pictures and just emailing them in at that point. That became overwhelming, so that spurred the development of Bumblebee Watch, where people can track all different kinds of bumblebees and send that information in. That program started in 2014. In 2017, so it took from 2000 when we first saw that disappearance to 2017 to get an endangered species listing for the rusty patch bumblebee. But that was listed, given federal protection in 2017 due to this really severe range decline, losing half or more of its range, and even when it is present, being severely decreased in abundance, about a 90% decline in abundance. So just to mention, shortly after that, we started these Bumblebee Atlas programs, which now we are integrating in here with the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. But just to kind of show you that a lot of what's happening with the Atlas built out of awareness of bumblebees and conservation concern, and awareness of the importance of people getting out there and sharing observations to Rusty Patch Bumblebee conservation. So we do have these federal protections for the rusty patch bumblebee, and we'll go more into this. But the Fish and Wildlife Service takes data on where rusty patch bumblebees have been seen within the last 7 years, and then they also look at the habitat and they make these zones for areas that are currently occupied by rusty patch bumblebee, which are marked by red, as well as areas that are likely to be occupied. So that's areas that they might be dispersing out to, and you have to have a scientific recovery permit that's issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service to catch and release bumblebees within those zones. So this impacts grid adoption for us here in Minnesota and in Iowa. And it impacts, we look at this at 3 different tiers of grid cell adoption. So in both of the states, we have many grids that don't contain those high or low potential zones. And so anyone can adopt a grid cell without additional training. Our tier 2 grid cells are cells where half or less of the grid cell is occupied by these high or low potential zones. And those are ones that anyone can adopt, but before you adopt, you have to complete this Rusty Patch Bumblebee training. You also have to take a quiz. And this is because even though they're not currently documented, it's really close to areas where they are documented, and it's likely just because people haven't looked enough to find them there. So it's still, fairly good chance of finding Rusty Patch. We want to be careful. So the limitations here are with those grid 2 cells are that you can survey in those cells, but only outside of those high and low potential zones, unless you're with someone who's permitted. And you can do photo only surveys within those higher low potential zones. We don't encourage those just because we get the quality of data we get is much better from surveys where we do catch and release. There are also tier 3 grid cells, and these are for grids where more than half of the cell is covered with those higher low potential zones. And these can only be adopted by people who have a federal recovery permit. Or you can also do the photo only surveys. So before you adopt those surveys, you need to complete this training, you need to take the quiz, but you also need to have a permit and share that permit number with the coordinators. The limitations for these tier 3 grid cells are that, if you don't have a permit, you're restricted to those photo only surveys. But those who are permitted can survey anywhere in those grids. So you may want to know how to figure out what tier your cell is in. So there, you can see this on the grid adoption map. I'm going to switch screens in a second and bring you over to that resource. There are kind of 3 different maps that you can look at. So there is just the Bumblebee Atlas grid map. We also have a Google map that might be a little bit easier when you're out and about. And there's also the kind of official map that's produced by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So let me see if I can manage to switch things around here. All right, so you are seeing the grid adoption map? Yeah, all right. So on the grid adoption map here, you can zoom in and see that there are these grid cells that have the slashes through them are ones where you need to have a permit, and you can zoom in and see the shaded out areas are those high potential zones. And then we have other grid cells that have a good amount of the high potential zone, but you can still those are areas where you need to kind of zoom in and work around it. For example, this Minnesota 6 has a good amount of area here, but you can find areas outside of those high potential zones. This is the Google map where you can, if you're really getting specific on where you're going, you can zoom in and see exactly where you are in relation to where that high potential zone is. And these are coming from this Fish and Wildlife Service map. Occasionally, these will be updated if there's, during the year, but usually they update it once a year in the spring. So this will likely be the map that will stay relevant. And this, you can see both the high and the low potential zones here. Yeah. Anything else I should show there before I switch back?
Yeah. Maybe if we could switch back to the adopted grid cell page, I just wanted to point out something related
Yeah.
to the page. Yeah, just so for all of you who are wondering, how do you figure out what tier a grid cell it is in? Like as Elaine mentioned, you can look at the whether or not the yellow blotches overlap with that grid cell. But we've also included little stars in front of the labels of each grid cell where you need to do additional trainings. So those two stars, those indicate that to adopt that grid cell, you need to complete this training and you need to take the quiz to prove your knowledge. And you need to do that for both those tier 2 grid cells and the tier 3 grid cells. Also too, if you click on the grid cell, Elaine, if you want to just click on the grid, yeah, if that will bring up a pop-up that will spell out exactly what the training or permitting requirements for that grid cell are. Also too, I want to mention that these resources, for all of them, you can do things like search the location that you want to check. So if you go to the search bar for the grid adoption map, to find an address or place.
Somewhere. I have trouble
It's a little-
navigating this map on the web.
Sorry, Elaine. Look, if you go to you're getting warmer. It's a little bit more to the right. Down, 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 a little down, a little. There you go.
There we go.
Sorry, it's okay. I actually don't really know my left from my right. So if you type in the latitude or longitude of a site, or if you type in the name of a site that you're interested in, that will bring up a bunch of different locations. Sometimes you have to be really, really specific with the location to bring up the thing you want to pop up, but that will take you to that location when you click it, and you can zoom out to check whether or not it's within that high or low potential zone. So that can be really helpful to you when you're trying to navigate the maps. All right, thanks, Elaine. I just wanted to mention that those specific tools and functions of the maps.
All right, that sounds good. And I think I shared my screen instead of the app, so it's still on. So now you can see the slides, right? Okay. So now that you've figured out where to go when you are out there surveying, so we'll talk at the end of this about how to recognize Rusty Patch Bumblebee, but if you do need to be looking out for them when you're surveying anywhere, even outside of those areas. And if you do see something that you suspect is a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, try not to that you're really sure is them, try not to capture. If you suspect that you've caught a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, pause your survey, identify the bee, and photograph it and release it. And if you did catch it, you should be releasing within 15 minutes. If you do find a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, please contact your coordinator. So for Minnesota, you can contact me or Jenny. For Iowa, you can contact Stephanie or Jenny. If if a Rusty Patch Bumblebee is verified, so once you send those photos in that you suspect and you hear back, yes, this was a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, you will need to find a new survey area to survey. If you are, not permitted and you're surveying in these areas that are outside of those known areas, you'll need to find a new survey area that is 1.5 kilometers away. So don't return to that same survey area unless you're with someone who has that federal permit, or you plan to conduct just the photo only surveys. Best handling practices. So we are especially concerned about safety for Rusty Patch, but we're really concerned about safety for all of the bumblebees out there. So so this applies, across all surveys that you're doing, to only have one bee per vial. It can be tempting sometimes if they're two together to just, oh, this will be quicker and faster. It's safer to just have one bee per vial. Um, um, Unless you have that bee in a cooler with ice, don't have that bee in that container for more than 5 minutes. Also, try to keep them out of direct sunlight that entire time. Don't hold bees in a cooler with ice for more than 2 hours. And release the bees near flowers on which they're found and in a shaded area. Sometimes they need a little bit of time to recover, and it's good to have them just in the shade so they can get back to what they're doing. We also need you to clean and sanitize your equipment. So your nets and your vials should be sanitized between each survey that you're doing. And you can use a dilute bleach solution, or you can use rubbing alcohol or alcohol wipes. The nets you can wash in soapy water. Make sure that you let the equipment dry completely before using. And I think, Jenny, you wanted to talk about this.
Elaine. So Xerces does hold a federal recovery permit to recover the rusty patch bumblebee. So this is something that we like to open up to volunteers so that you can apply to be a subcommittee on our permit. I do want to mention that hopefully we'll be able to open that process up for you guys this year. However, there is a slight chance that the project will not be continued to be funded in we may not continue to hold our funding next year. So, I think Elaine and Elise will continue to do this project forever, hopefully, but I'm not quite as sure what the status will be in Iowa. And Xerces may not be able to open up that option for adding folks to be on our permit for the next field season. So just want to give you guys a little heads up about that. Hopefully we will continue to do this work and we will continue to be able to add people to the permit, but please just keep in mind that's something we're trying to do, but it might not necessarily happen next year. However, if we do have that opportunity for you guys, we basically need to prove to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that you can handle rusty patch bumblebees without harming them, and that you have the experience needed to identify rusty patch bumblebees and fill out our data forms so that we can actually submit that data to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the standards for being added to our permit as a subcommittee are pretty high. You need to showcase that you have experience working with bumblebees, surveying and identifying the rusty patch bumblebee, and then you also need to have 2 letters of recommendation. The coordinator in your state can provide one of those letters of recommendation if you are an experienced volunteer, but if you aren't an experienced volunteer, you're going to need to get letters of recommendation from professional researchers or scientists to indicate that you have the experience that you need to be added to the permit. If you want to go ahead, Elaine. So just to give you a better idea of what it means to have adequate experience surveying and identifying bumblebees, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has given us some guidelines for you all. So basically, you need to showcase that you know how to do Atlas protocols. So to do that, you need to complete our online training workshops, as well as this online Rusty Patch Bumblebee training, which hopefully you already have in the bag, since this is the 3rd workshop in that the 3rd webinar in this 3-part training series. You also need to pass our Rusty Patch Bumblebee quiz to showcase that you understand what we've gone through in this training today. You also need to attend at least one in-person training to make sure that you have the field skills down. You need to complete at least 4 Bumblebee Atlas surveys independently to showcase that you can do surveys on your own. We also ask that you can showcase that you've safely collected at least 50 bumblebees, and that you've logged these observations on Bumblebee Watch so we can verify them. So those are bumblebees that you've collected, like physically, that you've netted and put in a vial and photographed, not bumblebees that you've observed on flowers. We also ask that you demonstrate proficiency in identifying the bumblebees. So by correctly identifying the species that you submit to Bumblebee Watch, and that you've completed an advanced course on bumblebee identification. So either Elaine's course that she holds each year, that's run by the University of Minnesota Bee Team, or the advanced training that we do in December or that we did last December, that's online on bee identification for the Atlas. So there are a lot of steps, and I know it seems like quite a bit, but this is all just so that we can showcase that you guys are really, really well trained and that you are ready to handle an endangered species, because rusty patch bumblebees, they are a threatened species, and we really just want to make sure that the folks who are going out there and swinging a net at them are knowing exactly what they're doing for this. All right, I think that pretty much covers it.
All right, sweet. I was just going to, before I pass things off to Elise to go over some ID, there's a question about, from Anna, if I do a survey outside of those potential zones, but accidentally catch a rusty patch, should I chill the bee to take photos, or take photos in a vial and then release as soon as possible? So it is really important to get the good photos. If you have already captured it into a vial, I would recommend chilling, but keeping an eye on them, just chilling them till they've calmed down enough to get those good photos, and then releasing them as soon as you can. All right, I am going to pass things over to Elise.
Let me get my screen share going here. Okay, can you guys see that okay?
You need to put it in slideshow. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm just going to talk about how to identify rusty patch bumblebee in the field, as well as some other bumblebees that are sometimes mistaken as rusty patch. So hopefully many of you on this webinar today attended part 2 in our training series, where we talked about identifying bumblebees generally. In that presentation, I broke down the different body parts of the bumblebee, but just as a quick refresher, we have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen is broken up into these individual segments called terga. So the segments on the abdomen are important when it comes to identifying rusty patch, as well as lots of other bumblebee species. So if we're looking at the specifics of identifying rusty patch bumblebee, if we start with our thorax here, we can see it is mostly yellow, but between the wings here, there are these black hairs that make this sort of umbrella or thumbtack shape, right sort of in the center of the thorax there. On the abdomen, the first abdominal segment is yellow all the way across. The second segment is where we see this characteristic rusty patch, sort of a crescent shape of brown rusty hairs, generally more in the center of that segment. And then going all the way to the edges of the segment are more yellow hairs. So I like to think of it as sort of this sandwich that makes up the rusty patch. So we have yellow hairs, followed by the brown rusty hairs, followed by more yellow, and then the rest of our abdominal segments are black. The males look very similar. They have generally the same color pattern as the females do. So here is an example photo of what the rusty patch bumblebee looks like in action. So we can see here on the thorax, there's lots of yellow hairs. And then between our wings is where we see that distinctive thumbtack or umbrella shape. So we've got black hairs sort of in this band, and then where the handle of the umbrella would be, there are some more black hairs there. Then on our abdomen, our first abdominal segment is yellow. And then we can see sort of this little rusty patch peeking out from the sides of where this bee is holding her wings, but then followed by more yellow hairs, and then the rest of those segments are black. Males can be a little bit trickier sometimes because the umbrella shape on their thorax is usually a little bit less well defined. So we can see on this bee here, there's that sort of broad band of black hairs between the wings, but where the handle of the umbrella would be is a little bit less clear. We're just seeing a lot more yellow there. But the color pattern on the abdomen is still the same. So that first abdominal segment is yellow all the way across. Then we see this brown crescent shape of rusty hairs, followed by more yellow hairs on that same segment. And then the rest of those segments are black. Another nice example of a rusty patch bumblebee. She's got her wings held out of the way nicely for us so we can see kind of what's going on here. If we start with looking at the thorax, we see lots of yellow hairs. Then we see that band of black between the wings. We can see a little bit more black hairs, kind of where the handle of the umbrella would be, if you picture what that thumbtack or umbrella shape looks like. Then when we're looking at the abdomen, we can really clearly see there's yellow hairs here on this first segment. Second segment, got this nice big brown rusty patch, followed by more yellow hairs on the same segment. So like all bumblebees, there is some amount of variability to be expected. So sometimes the rusty patch can be small or a little obscure. So this bee that we just looked at, this is a really big, really clearly, nicely defined brown rusty patch, but sometimes it can be a little bit smaller or a little bit more obscure. So if we're looking at this bee from the side view, we can tell that she's got yellow hairs on top, a black band between her wings, but then the rusty patch that shows up on her abdomen is a little bit hidden. We can see there's yellow hairs here on this first segment, but the brown rusty patch is sort of tucked or hidden there underneath the wings. So when you are surveying in these grid cells that require this rusty patch bumblebee training, just take extra care when you're capturing bumblebees to make sure you're looking at them, seeing if they have a rusty patch that might be hiding underneath their wings. Here's another example of what that patch can look like when it's a little bit more obscure. So if we start on the thorax first, we can see we've got lots of yellow hairs and then this band of black between the wings. If we were looking at this bee from the top, we'd be able to see where that black extends down. Then on our abdomen, we've got yellow hairs again here on the first segment. And then we do have a bit of a rusty patch on the second segment, but it is not very clearly defined. It's a little bit lighter brown and blends in a little bit more with the rest of the yellow hairs on that second segment. So I want to talk just quickly about rusty patch bumblebee queens, because as you'll notice, they look quite a bit different from the workers and the males. What is missing from our rusty patch bumblebee queens is the rusty patch. Queens do not typically have the brown rusty patch that we see on the workers. Of course, color patterns vary. The queens occasionally will have some rusty patch, but it is not typical. So there are a few key characters we can look at to help verify if we're seeing a rusty patch bumblebee queen. These queens are generally pretty large, even for being queens. I'll show a comparison of some different sizes here in a minute, but just know that they're generally larger, more robust bees. If we're looking at their heads, they have these sort of short faces, lots of black hairs on the top of their head. If we're looking at their thorax, we see mostly yellow hairs, and then they just have black hairs kind of in a spot in the center of the thorax. They don't have that umbrella or thumbtack shape either, just some centrally located black hairs on their thorax. And then on their abdomen, the first two abdominal segments are just these complete yellow bands of hairs that run across the segments. So here is just a comparison of sizes. So on the left, we have Bombus oricomis, which is the black and gold bumblebee, which is the largest bumblebee that we have in Minnesota. But the second largest queen is Bombus affinis. So this is the rusty patch bumblebee. So they are really large, and they have these sort of velvety looking, more close cropped kind of hairs. And this is in comparison also to the brown-belted bumblebee and the half-black bumblebee. So here are just some photos of a rusty patch bumblebee queen. Sometimes when you're actually out in the fields, it's easier to tell sort of how big a bee is than compared to when you're just looking at photos. But if we're looking at her characteristics here, if we look at her head, we're seeing lots of black hairs on the top of the head there. On her thorax, it's mostly yellow hairs with some black hairs in the center. If we look at the texture of those hairs, they kind of look soft and more velvety. And then if we're looking at our abdomen here, we've got yellow hairs on that first abdominal segment as well as the second abdominal segment. So really just these broad bands of hairs that are yellow and velvety. Here's another look at a rusty patch bumblebee queen. From this angle, we can see that she has a short face. So when we talk about the face, we're talking about sort of the cheek of the bumblebee or the space between where their bottom of their compound eye ends down to where their mouth parts are. The different species have different lengths of that space, but rusty patch bumblebees have shorter faces. Then again, black hairs on the top of the head, lots of yellow hairs, yellow velvety looking hairs on the thorax, and then more yellow hairs on the first two abdominal segments. There are, however, other more common bumblebee species that are sometimes mistaken as the rusty patch. So I just want to talk through a few of those species. The first is Bombus ternarius, which is the tricolored bumblebee. They also have orange color on their abdomens. So for rusty patch here on the left, we can see where that sandwich is with the yellow, then there's the brown rusty patch and then more yellow. And this is a sort of more brown color on that second segment. Whereas on Bombus ternarius or the tricolored bumblebee, that orangey reddish color is generally a little bit more obvious, and it takes up the entirety of the second and third abdominal segments. The tricolored bumblebee also has a similar umbrella shape on their thorax, but this band of black hairs between the wings is much broader than what we see on the rusty patch bumblebee. Another bee that's sometimes mistaken as rusty patch is Bombus rufocinctus, or the red-belted bumblebee. So if we look first at our rusty patch bumblebee here on the left, we've got yellow hairs on the first segment, and then we can see where that sort of brown rusty patch followed by more yellow hairs on the same segment are. But if we look at the red-belted bumblebee here on the right, they do also have a broad band of black hairs between their wings, but they don't have that sort of umbrella handle or black hairs that extend towards the end of their thorax. The red-belted bumblebee also has some red or orange hairs, but these hairs generally don't start until either the end of the second segment or onto the third abdominal segment. And they're sometimes a little bit more intermixed with those yellow hairs. And then we also see more yellow hairs after that orange that we see on the second, third, and fourth segments. Another bee that is sometimes mistaken for rusty patch is the brown-belted bumblebee, or Bombus griseocolus. The brown-belted bumblebee is one of the most common species of bumblebees in the Midwestern United States. So this is one that's important to be able to tell the difference. And what we're looking at here is the color at the edge of the second abdominal segment. So on our rusty patch bumblebee here on the left, we have yellow, followed by the brown rusty patch, followed by more yellow on the same segment as that rusty patch. But for our brown-belted bumblebee here on the right, our first abdominal segment is yellow. Second segment has this crescent shape of brown hairs, but then it is followed by black for the rest of the segments. And the brown-belted bumblebee does not have that sort of umbrella shape of black hairs on its thorax. Another bee that we have to watch out for is Bombus vagans, which is the half-black bumblebee. So the things we're looking at to differentiate it from rusty patch are the second abdominal segment as well as the face. So we have this rusty patch, on our rusty patch bumblebee. We have yellow, brown rusty patch, and then more yellow. If we could see the face of this bee, it would be short. If we look at Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee here on the right, we can see kind of from this angle that this bee has a longer face. So we're looking at where the compound eye ends down to the mouth parts. And then the first two segments are completely yellow on the half-black bumblebee, and this bee is generally a little bit shaggier in terms of the texture of its hairs than rusty patch bumblebee is. Bombus vagans also does not have the umbrella or thumbtack shape of black hairs on its thorax. If we look at the faces up close here, so this is a better view of what we're talking about when we say a short face. So we can see where the compound eye ends and where the mouth parts are. This is a much shorter distance than what we see on the half-black bumblebee. This bee has a long face, so where the mouth parts are to the compound eye is a longer distance than what we see on rusty patch. It's important to watch out for shadows. So shadows can cast a light on bumblebees that makes it look like their hairs are a different color or that there's patterns there when it's really just the way the light is hitting the bee. So this photo on the left here, this is rusty patch bumblebee, but because of the way the lighting is shining on the bee, it makes it a little bit more difficult to tell. These other photos here are both Bombus vagans, which is the half-black bumblebee. This photo on the right, I think, is one that is a great example of what we're talking about when we're talking about shadows. If we look at the abdomen here, sort of between the wings, it really looks like this might be a rusty patch, but it is just a shadow, just the way that the light is showing on the bee. And we know that it's the half-black bumblebee and not rusty patch because it doesn't have the umbrella or thumbtack shape on its thorax, and it's generally a little bit shaggier in appearance than rusty patch bumblebee is. And then the last comparison that I'll talk about is the rusty patch bumblebee and Bombus citrinus males. Bombus citrinus is the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, and the males are also sometimes mistaken for rusty patch, but the things that we're looking at are the third abdominal segment as well as the head. So both of these bees can have this umbrella or thumbtack shape of black hairs on their thoraxes. But when we look at Bombus citrinus here on the right, this is a cuckoo bumblebee, so they have thick heads. If we looked at that in comparison to rusty patch bumblebee, sort of the top of the head is much wider and thicker. And if we look at the third abdominal segment, there are yellow hairs, whereas on Rusty Patch Bumblebee, the third abdominal segment just has black hairs. So that is sort of the quick rundown of how to identify Rusty Patch Bumblebee, as well as some of the other species that are commonly sometimes mistaken for Rusty Patch. Do we have any questions or things in the chat to touch on for ID?
So for folks out in the audience, if you have any questions about any of the content, it looks like we have plenty of time for questions, so you can go ahead and just post those in the Q&A, and then we'll answer them as they come up.
I guess one thing that we didn't talk about, that's, oops, it's echoing on me. One thing that rarely happens, but can be good to be aware of what to do. We have sometimes had volunteers that find a dead Rusty Patch Bumblebee. Or, sometimes a Rusty Patch Bumblebee can be super stressed out, and even though we're using the safest methods we know, a Rusty Patch may die. But we have had volunteers just find, like an assassin bug with the Rusty Patch Bumblebee in its mouth. And those dead specimens are very valuable for research, for people who are looking at genetics with the bees, looking at diseases with the bees. So there's a whole kind of system of scientists that are interested in looking at those bees. And so so it is important, if you do find one or accidentally one is injured, it's really important to report that to your coordinators as soon as possible. If there is a specimen that is dead, to just get it on ice, get it into a freezer, and contact people as soon as you can, and we can kind of deal with it from there. And, photographing, explaining, getting the location from where you are, if it's one you find, you're done with your survey and you're walking back to the car and you find a Rusty Patch in an assassin bug's mouth, just get the location, get a photo of the situation so that we can have all the context.
Looks like we've got a couple questions in the chat, or in the Q&A, sorry. The first one is, are there books or recommended references for Bumblebee ID? So there are lots and lots of different references out there for BID. A lot of them are super awesome. As we mentioned, there are lots of YouTube videos that you can check out for BID. If you see a bee and you take a photo of it, you can check out one of our videos to help you with that. In terms of print guidance, Bumblebees of North America is a publication that is super great. It's a book that includes all of the different bumblebees that you'll find in North America, and that is something that you would need to purchase. There are also some free references out there. So Bumblebees of the Eastern United States and Bumblebees of the Western United States are two guides that are available online for free that you can just go ahead and download, print PDF copies of. They're super great. They have all sorts of different guides in terms of like what color patterns you might expect for different species of bumblebees. And then we also have our Bumblebee Atlas field guides, which are just like a single page printout that you can bring in the field with you. And they're a little bit simple. They don't have every single color variant that you'll find in the field. But in terms of like a quick reference when you're out in the field looking at bees, they're great if you just need a refresher on, what different color hairs are on this specific species vertex.
And I put the reference, there's links to everything Jenny talked about in the chat.
Sorry, for the next question, if you adopted a grid cell from last year, do you still need to redo the quiz to confirm your knowledge? Both this year and last year, I adopted the same grid cells, and basically I'm good to go and fully aware of Rusty Patch Bumblebee guidelines. So the answer to that is if you took the quiz last year, there's no need to retake it. It's the same quiz with the same content. So you are good to go.
I'm not sure if there are any more questions. Phil, I see your stuff in the Q&A. I'm not, I'm not sure if there's a question there. So, you know, when you're have, you know, other people in the area there, you know, federal permit would be required for handling the bumblebees. So if there is a permit holder, they can oversee other people that would be handling bumblebees. So we do that with some of our community surveys where we have other people come and help us, but we always have one permitted person that's there that can oversee the other people. A permit is not would not if you're not handling the bumblebees. So you can do you know, there are options to do field day with just with just photos. But yeah, as long as there's somebody who's permitted and who explains to anyone that is potentially handling bumblebees all of the safety, and that people are kind of within view of that person, and, you know, that person, the permit holder will be responsible. And let's see, Suzanne is asking about photo-only surveys in high potential areas. So if you do not have a permit and you want to survey in a high potential area, there is the option to do the photo-only surveys. We didn't talk about them a lot, just that we prefer when we can have surveys that are done with the catch and release. We feel more confident in our the amount of effort that's going into catching bees. We also have more reliable photos to ID bees from, but it is there because we do want people to have this option. So it is a viable option to not handle bumblebees and to just do these photo only surveys so we can you know, see who's there. All right, so questions seem to have slowed down. So we are, of course, always available to take to answer your questions. If you want to email any of us, I'll just put mine in the chat here. Always happy to look at pictures that people think are Rusty Patch bumblebees. So even if you have them in Bumblebee Watch and you want somebody to look at it right away, just you can share that signing from Bumblebee Watch with any one of us if you want to get eyes on it sooner. We're always happy to do that. Yeah, excited to have more people out there looking for Rusty Patch bumblebees.
And I just want to jump
All
in
the
and
other good
say,
bees.
I just want to jump in and say, you know, this meeting was recorded, so if you came in late or you want to review any of the content, keep an eye out. We'll be posting the recording soon, and we'll be sending you that follow-up email with all of the different links and the information we mentioned today. Also, at the end of this, you will, once you log out, see a survey pop up. If you could fill that out, it's great for us to know what you liked and what you didn't like so that we can improve the content for these webinars. So we'd really appreciate if you take the time to fill that out at the end of this session as you log out. For being here today, I think we'll wrap up our recording. Have a great one.